couple minutes. We'll do the poll.
And then Tony Lynn, do you want me to just launch the poll right now?
Yeah, please.
No problem.
Welcome, folks. You should see a poll in front of you. So just go ahead and take your time with that as we wait for people to arrive. I do understand if you're having any existential crisis by answering the first question of what is your region. I went through like 3 different iterations of wondering if I should say like that you work in or that you live in or that you like love the most. You can choose whichever of those that you want. I can't answer it because I'm a host, so I get to avoid the existential crisis of what is my favorite region. And you'll see my colleague, Dr. Golden's about to introduce himself in the chat. So if you can share your name, where you're based. Again, there's that question. And something else that'll come up really soon. Let's make sure our mics are off. Whether you'll be attending ESA 2026. We love emojis. So just before I get us started here, maybe if you're through the poll, go ahead and find your favorite emoji. So they're under React. There's like a heart, or as the 7th grader in my life taught me, heart. And if you click the arrow next to it, you should be able to see, hopefully, hopefully they're available. Oh no, you just click on React and then you'll see. Thank you. It looks like we don't have all the very interesting options here, but I see a rocket ship. That's kind of fun. Great. So, and as it says here, questions in the chat are great. We'll answer them in the end. All right. So I am gonna move us on to the next thing we're doing today, which is gonna be able to introduce our section here and then here from our eminent Dr. Bethany Bradley. But first, welcome to the climate adaptation section, first webinar. I hope that you know this, but maybe you don't, that this is one of the newest sections of the Ecological Society of America. The idea was born several years ago. In fact, this is a session at ESA where we talked about it. Laura Thompson's at the mic. She's one of the members of the leadership of the climate adaptation section. And you might see other people in the crowd that you recognize. And we had this really great, vibrant kind of back-to-back session on climate adaptation. And we realized how much people really want to be talking about this. So a bunch of folks, including staff and scientists from the U.S. Geological Survey Climate Adaptation Science Centers spearheaded an effort to get enough signatures to convince the ESA leadership that this was important enough to all of you. And so we got the section started. And it's been about a year, but we've had 2 kickoff meetings, or sort of a like scoping meeting, and then a kickoff in December. And we're really excited to be here with our first webinar. And I'll just say who we are as the leadership of your Friendly Neighborhood Climate Adaptation section. That's me on the left. I work at the USGS Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center at USGS as a research ecologist, an adjunct in environmental conservation at UMass Amherst. You'll be hearing from Dr. Nigel Golden shortly. He is at Woodwell Climate Research Center. We also have with us today our treasurer, Bob Newman, chair at University of North Dakota. I just already mentioned Laura Thompson, who is our liaison. She's also at the CASC, and Yalen Go, I believe, is here and is at Louisiana State. So that is this kind of starting leadership of the group. We'd be very happy to have a student join our leadership, and also we're already kind of fast approaching the fall when we have an election and you might want to join the leadership. So keep an eye out for that. Also, I should say that we have a listserv and we want to make sure you're on it. So I'll drop a link in the chat to make sure you can sign up for that if you want. So I'm going to now hand it over to Dr. Golden, who will tell you about what we've been doing so far.
Thank you, Tony Lynn. You can go to the next slide. So first thing we want to share is that the climate adaptation section has posted and will be sharing our section's charter. So we had our first section business meeting in December, and we used that time to hear from all of you, all the members who are part of the section, what exactly they would like to see from the climate adaptation section. Why do they want to join? What type of work do they want to see us doing? What type of communications and what purpose should we be working towards? And so just to start us off, right, our vision statement is to promote awareness and action to address climate adaptation across all areas of ecology, from research to practice to policy. And then a summary of that discussion, I'll drop the link here in the chat now, which is a PDF version of our charter. You can find a lot more information there, specifically about what members in the section have stated and how we hope to move forward doing this work together. So another important announcement is that some of us will be at ESA 2026. I unfortunately have field work at Toolik Field Station in the Brooks Range in Alaska, kind of a boo and yay situation. But both members of our section will be there and will also be leading as well climate adaptation at ESA, moving from theory to practice to change with the world. And we have Tony Lynn Morelli, who is currently our chair, who will be presenting. Laura will also be presenting, who's in the section members, and other folks who are in our network and we've been interacting with and have been doing really awesome and cool climate adaptation science work. So we hope to see you all at that session as well. And then dates to remember for those of you who are on the call. So the deadline to submit for the late breaking and proposal for poster abstracts is on April 23rd. That date is fast approaching. And so, if you are already knowing at the moment that you do want to share your work at ESA 2026, this is the time this week to work towards getting those submissions in so that we can all see you in August. And so this is connected from our business meeting that we had in December, sharing a poll similar to the one that we shared earlier about what type of work folks would like to see us do as a section at ESA. And so one of the top items that came out of that was a knowledge co-production webinar from a topical expert. That would be Bethany Bradley, and we're doing that as requested. So we just want to show the evidence as well that we're working towards what all of our members in the section said that they would like to see from us. And so I have the honor of introducing Dr. Bethany Bradley. She is a professor of biogeography, invasion, and ecology at the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where her work sit at a fascinating intersection of spatial ecology, climate change, and the very real management challenges facing natural landscapes today. Her research asks a deceptively simple question: where do invasive species thrive and where might they spread? And by combining tools from biogeography, landscape ecology, Dr. Bradley maps how invasion risk varies across regions in response to land use change, human disturbance, and a shifting climate. Beyond her research, Dr. Bradley is deeply committed to turning science into action, and I think we'll be seeing a bit of that in her presentation today, right? She co-directs the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center and co-founded the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, two collaborative initiatives that bring researchers and on-the-ground practitioners to develop climate-smart strategies for managing our natural resources. In short, Bethany is doing the kind of work that doesn't just help us understand how ecosystems are changing, it helps us do something about it, and we're delighted to have her with us today. So please welcome Dr. Bethany Bradley.
Thanks so much, Nigel. Really appreciate that introduction, and thanks everybody who's here today. It's exciting to kick off a new section at ESA, and a really section that is near and dear to my heart, and I imagine everybody else's hearts who are here as well. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that all of the research and engagement outreach activities that I will be talking about today have been supported by federal grants. Those grants have largely come through the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is part of the U.S. Geological Survey's ecosystem mission area. The CASCs have more or less survived the massive cuts to science that have happened over the last year plus. However, funding for the ecosystem mission area has once again been eliminated in President Trump's proposed budget for fiscal year 27. And the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change, or RISC Network, is a flagship program of the CASCs. So they remain, both the Northeast and other regions remain similarly at risk. That out of the way, what I want to talk about today is kind of a story of my journey through science and through science engagement or actionable science. I think I'm guessing like many of us in this room, I got into the field of science originally because I was really interested in solving environmental challenges, environmental problems. And then I would say through graduate school, postdoc, and early faculty years, I mostly got sidetracked by doing what was pretty cool science, but not necessarily actionable science, or not thinking about the way to get that science into practice and into management. And so what I want to tell you guys about today is a story of how I've sort of learned over the last 10 years or so to be useful again, to go back to those roots of wanting to solve environmental problems. Hopefully still with some cool science built in there as well. All right, I'm going to see if I can get my Zoom things to go to a different place that I can advance slides. All right, excellent. As you all, I'm sure, are aware, climate change is one of the greatest threats facing my generation, your generation, future generations to come. Climate change is happening really fast, which means that ecosystems have to adapt really quickly. And really, what that means is ecosystems can't, for the most part, adapt on their own, and they really need us to help to adapt to climate change. So I'm going to focus today on invasive species. And the reason for focusing on invasive species is because they consistently come out at the top whenever we ask natural resource managers about their priorities in climate-related science or climate-related fields. So this is a graph from surveys from 2018 and 2020 that were sent to state fish and wildlife agencies. And I realize that you can't actually read what's along the x-axis, but the one all the way to the left, the top priority, is invasive species movement and range expansion. And this is consistent across studies that invasive species come out as a high priority for climate adaptation. So I want to tell you a story about building climate smart invasive species management. Invasive species, if you're not aware of what they are introduced species that have established populations in natural environments that are spreading and that are causing harm to ecosystems. So this is an example of studies. This is a paper from 2013 by Hume and others, looking at how many studies there are out there about invasive species impacts. And you can see from this graph that it's increasing a lot, and we know actually quite a bit about invasive species impacts. So 10, 12, 15 years ago, whenever this was published in 2013, what you can see on here is that the black squares are the numbers of published papers on invasive species impacts each year. And where this one ends in 2010, we were publishing on the order of 300 impacts papers each year. So nearly a study every day if you get a few weekends off in there. And then this, in comparison, is a figure from a paper by Matzek et al. From 2015, so just a couple years after that previous figure. And this is based on surveys of invasive species managers. And what invasive species managers are reporting is that they're not getting enough information, not getting the information that they need about invasive species impacts, among other things. Like they're also not getting information about early detection and the abandonment of management, for example. And so if you kind of juxtapose those two things, which are happening in the same time period 15 years ago or thereabouts, this suggests to me that the information about invasive species negative consequences or impacts is out there. It's just not getting to managers who are saying that they don't have this information. So typically in science, even in science that considers itself to be applied, publication is often the end of a project. So that is, we publish a paper or make a tool, and then we kind of hope or assume that someone out there is going to find it, that managers are going to know where to look for it. This is often referred to as a loading dock approach. So, like beep, 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 the truck backs up, dumps something off, and hopes that someone is going to be there later on. Unfortunately, studies repeatedly show that there's a really big gap between science and management, and that's often referred to as the knowing-doing gap. So if scientists do applicable work, but have no interaction with managers, then that work just isn't making it into practice. And 10 years ago, I thought, and this was true, I thought that there was a lot of research out there on invasive species and climate change. So here's where we're getting into that intersection with climate adaptation. And this was around the time when I first met Toni Lynn Morelli, who was at the introduced at the beginning of this webinar. She is a research ecologist with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I also met Carrie Brown Lima, who at that time was the director of the New York Invasive Species Research Institute in the state of New York. And from both of them, I learned that a major question that natural resource managers were asking was, how do we manage biological invasions in light of climate change? And yet I thought we knew a whole lot about invasive species and climate change. And so this really kind of turned my thinking from what more new science can we do in the realm of invasive species and climate change to how do we get the science that's already out there into the hands of managers? So that question really started a translational science process that has led to learning more about needs. So we started with the manager questions. So we've done a bunch of workshop survey work to learn more about manager needs. We've addressed those needs through research and then shared that information back to managers through synthesis and information sharing. And then the cool part about this project is that initial question of how are invasive species interacting with climate change has led to more questions and better questions about how, the more specifics about interactions between climate adaptation, and invasive species. And so hopefully I'll also convince you that this process has led to lots of cool products like publications and synthesis documents, that it's led to a big increase in the communications between scientists and managers, and especially not just between scientists and managers, but between managers who have a lot of really important information on this topic to share. And then lastly, I hope to convince you that our work in translational science is having broader impacts on the knowledge and on the practice of climate smart invasive species management. All right, so we started with this question, and this was coming largely from Carrie Brown Lima, who was then the director, as I said before, of the New York Invasive Species Research Institute. And she was talking to lots of invasive species managers in New York State who were telling her that they needed more information on interactions between invasive species and climate change. And so the problem with that from a science perspective is that's a really broad question, and clearly nobody's going to be able to just run right in and answer that whole question for everybody's end user needs in a single research project, or arguably even in a single career. So given that we were starting with this really broad management question, we first needed to narrow things down to prioritize potential work. So we made a survey, my first experience with doing any kind of survey solicitation and synthesis. And we sent it out to invasive species managers, whoever we could think of, basically across the Northeast. And then we got back rankings of priority topics on how invasive species interact with climate change. So it turns out that asking people what they need is a pretty good way to start a research project. And then on top of that, you can see this was a paper published by Bury et al., who was a PhD student at the time. So we also published these results, which checks a scientific deliverable box too. When you look at that list of priorities, the second topic here pertains to identifying range-shifting species and invasion hotspots with climate change. So the good news was that we had already done some of this research, and this is from a paper led by Jenica Allen, published in 2016, that modeled the potential future range shifts of almost 900 invasive plant species in the US. And one key result of this work was to highlight that the Northeast region, and really across many of our higher elevation, higher latitude regions, but the Northeast in particular, which is where I live and work, is a hotspot of future invasion risk with climate change. And this shows that up to 100 new invasive plant species could shift or expand into the Northeast region by mid-century. So this is a map. It was in a paper in that loading dock, but it was not yet actionable. So given that we had heard from a manager network that they're not getting this information, and that this was the second of those priority lists of things to address, we were able to use that information to get a small grant from the Northeast Integrated Pest Management Center, which is part of the US Department of Agriculture. And we were able to build a web tool with the results from that paper. That tool was built in collaboration with EdMaps, the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System run out of the University of Georgia. That website is really commonly used by managers to track invasive species distribution, so it was a good place to host a tool for looking at range shifting invasive plants. And so with this tool, managers can look up a specific state or county anywhere in the US and then generate a list of invasive plants that are not currently present in that state or county, but could expand with climate change. Oops, lost the slide. So that generated a list of lots of different invasive plant species. Some of them are pictured here. And so for me, this is my first, like actionable science project. And so I was like, great, we're going to put together this workshop and we'll bring our results back and everybody immediately will be like, exactly what I needed, and like run home with our piece of paper of these lists of species, right? So we convened a workshop. We brought in state invasive plant council representatives. So we call this our IPCs working group. This was initially for New York and New England. Since that time, which was 2019 when we first did this, that group has continued to meet about twice a year and has expanded into the Mid-Atlantic and up into Canada. So we presented these watch lists to this IPC's working group, and they basically said, wait a second, how many species do you want us to look out for? Because there were like 100 species or something like that, or a couple hundred species on our list. And so then we said, okay, well, I guess identifying the list of range shifting invasive species was not the only thing that everybody needed, but in fact, what we need is a prioritization of those 100 plus range shifting invasive species. And so around this time, there was a new protocol that was available called the Environmental Impact Classification for Alien Taxa. This was developed by a bunch of researchers in Europe and in South Africa, and recommended by the IUCN as a protocol for identifying and comparing invasive species impacts. We had several different groups of range shifting invasive species, a set for southern New England and New York. So southern New England being Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York. Northern New England, we had a set that was for Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And then we did another set for mid-Atlantic states, which I'm not going to list because I will get them wrong. A little further south of us, from basically Kentucky to Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So we had a bunch of largely undergraduate-led projects that performed these impact assessments on range-shifting invasive plants, nearly 300 in total across the Northeast. So that was a basically series of research projects that were aimed at synthesizing our knowledge of ecological and economic impacts of invasive plants. And it turns out that, like I said, the lead authors on all of these are undergraduate students, and data synthesis, I learned through these projects, is a really great activity for scientists who are just starting out. So we ended up with 3 papers, really good for the students for that. For Southern New England, I'll just focus on one of these projects. So for Southern New England, we started with that list of 100 range-shifting invasive species, and we were able to narrow it down to 5 high-priority species. And those 5 high-priority species were ones that had major impacts, either ecological or economic, on ecosystems that either were in the Northeast or were similar to Northeast ecosystems. So we presented that information on that research. We synthesized it into what we then called a management challenge document, this like couple-page synthesis. And that resource has been downloaded more than 1,000 times, so 1,700 times. And for me as a scientist, that's a huge reach, right? Like, I'm used to getting papers cited a few dozen times if they're really good papers. And so a lot of people were seeing this information. Very gratifying. So we had those 2 science projects in direct response to what this Invasive Plant Council group had said. And then we had further discussions with that IPC's working group, and it also became clear that research could also help, and synthesis research in particular, could help us to better understand how to make state regulations more proactive and prevent the spread of invasive species. So the best case scenario for dealing with invasive species is to stop their introduction. And with range shifting invasive species, we actually have an opportunity to do that, which is really rare in invasive species management, where we can look out and see this is coming our way, this is a high priority, let's try to prevent it before it arrives. Invasive plants are regulated at the state level. So that means that most states have lists of plants that are prohibited for sale within that state. So this type of regulation is effective because the majority of invasive plants are introduced intentionally as ornamental plants in gardening and landscaping, and therefore prohibiting their sale actually does reduce the instances of invasive plant introduction. So we started a new research project here aimed at preventing range shifting invasive plants. And this project was led by Eve Beery and Emily Fusco, who were a graduate student and a postdoctoral researcher at the time. And they compiled all regulated species that were prohibited for sale from across the continental US to assess whether regulations were proactive. So in other words, were we preventing the sale of range shifting invasive plants? And as you can see on this slide, unfortunately across the US, the answer is generally no. That if you compare, if you look at all the different states, only 11% of plants are regulated proactively. And proactively here, we mean that they are prohibited for sale in the state and are not yet present in the state. In the Northeast specifically, if we look at kind of New York and New England states, not only are we not proactive, but we also tend to regulate invasive plants only once they are really widespread. So what you're seeing in this graph is our box plots that represent all regulated species in each state. The x-axis is the different states, and the y-axis is the fraction of counties in the states where the species is already present. So a 1 means that that regulated species is prohibited for sale in the state, but is already present in every single county. And a 0 means that it's prohibited for sale and it's not present in any county. So a 0 would be really proactive prevention, whereas a 1 is very reactive, closing the barn door after the horses escaped kind of thing. So you can see if you look at the first bar, New York, that New York is tending to regulate species when they're in a median of about 1/3 of New York's 62 counties. But the other northeastern states, the other New England states are not doing quite that well. So regulating species when they're much more widespread than just 1/3 of counties, closer to 75%. So from an invasive species management perspective, not good practice. We know that invasive species are much more feasible to control if we can stop them early. And certainly from a climate adaptation perspective, not great practice. So that question that practitioners were initially asking of are our state regulations working for invasive range shifting plants? We were able to pretty clearly say no, they are not currently working. But maybe we can help with some of that, because in looking at through regulations and talking to folks, we were able to kind of come up with some ideas of how we could do this a little bit better. And so we wrote down some of those some of those recommendations so that practitioners would have a science source to back them up. This is something that I've learned a lot in talking to managers, that things that are even, really straightforward, I would say even simple science to us, if they're published and out there, can be extremely helpful if they can be used by practitioners to say, this is what we know about this particular topic. Scientists are recommending we do this thing. Then that is really powerful for changing practice. So here are some of the recommendations that we had seen in our travels and in talking to folks and learning from these regulations. Recommendations that we had included that we need to share existing risk assessments. That seems like a really simple thing, but risk assessments are basically the process used to decide whether or not to regulate a species. And they tend to take a lot of effort to put together, and there's not a lot of funding to do those activities. So because for the most part, neighboring states weren't communicating and had really no mechanism for communicating with each other across state borders, we ended up with a lot of instances of reinventing the wheel. This is an example figure of that, where these are a bunch of common invasive plants that are regulated by both New York and New Hampshire. And we went through the bibliographies of the risk assessments conducted for these different species and looked at the sources that they cited to see which ones overlapped. So the overlapping sources are like the tiny gray bars in the middle there, and the unique sources to New York are in blue, and the unique sources to New Hampshire are in orange or red or something on there. A lot of reinvention of wheels here, a lot of, hey, if we could just share some of those sources, we wouldn't have to spend all this time looking for these various different things. And the other interesting thing about this is they ended up with like 2 totally different pools of knowledge, which might lead to different outcomes in your risk assessments. So we made a Google folder for the Invasive Plant Council members to share their risk assessments and look through what other people had put together, right? Pretty simple solutions. Through this process, we also had held some workshops to learn about climate smart actions that invasive species managers are already taking. And then we were able to synthesize those. So the synthesis document, Taking Action, this is a 2-page document that's basically just taking the information that managers told us and putting it into a single place where they can access it. That's been downloaded nearly 1,500 times. Again, way more than any paper that I've ever written. Another recommendations is that we also recognize that public education remains a key challenge, that people are confused about what invasive species are. They're confused about which species are invasive. They're confused about what they should do in their home gardens. Ornamental industries are also confused about what species are invasive. So we've made some synthesis resources to help invasive species managers to educate the public. We have several actually gardening related syntheses, and they have ended up being some of our most popular. This one is on ornamental plants to avoid selling because they're likely to become invasive with climate change, and it's been downloaded nearly 10,000 times since it was published in 2022, I believe. And then last recommendation is the need to learn from neighbors. So we really need to be building more connections between states so that we can understand what's headed our way, especially in the Northeast, because we have the luxury of a whole bunch of states to our south who are already dealing with these invasive species problems. That figure on the left is an example of responses to a question of who is managing stiltgrass, microstegium. And the red dots on here are people who reported in I think that this was from our 2018 survey actually, so it was a little bit before this was published. So the red ones are places that reported that stiltgrass was an emerging problem in their areas, and the blue ones are a bunch of managers who are currently managing stiltgrass, and then that sort of orange background is the distribution of stiltgrass across the eastern temperate forests. Which means that there's a lot of need for all of those red dot people to be talking to all of the blue dot people to learn about how to better manage this particular species among many other species. And unfortunately, when we started out, there really weren't many opportunities to engage across state borders. So one of the things that the Northeast RISC Network does a lot of is focusing on individual species and pairing practitioners, managers with scientists to develop and relay best practices. So because all of this work was done in direct collaboration with a working group of invasive plant council representatives, and it was done really directly to serve their needs, we've also seen some changes in state policy that the IPC's folks have told us is in directly resulting from the work that we've done in collaboration with them. In New York State, they have used the range shifting species that we provided to them to inform their risk assessment. So they popped some of those range shifting species into the top priorities for risk assessments. In Maine, there were 30 new plants that were added to their do not sell, their list of prohibited for sale species, based on resources that were shared between those different states. And in Massachusetts, they updated the invasive plant risk assessment criteria to explicitly say that we should be considering range shifting invasive species associated with climate change. And we even wrote a paper about that whole process of translational invasion ecology. So this was led by Tony Lynn Morelli, one of your hosts, and really just talking about the fact that this process of starting with a question, doing some research and research synthesis, trying to answer that question, and then ending up with better questions really leads to good, actionable science, and also plenty of really interesting science questions. Like all of this has been really fun for me as a scientist. And so even more importantly, this process was like basically while we were doing all of this, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. We were also building and then continuing to expand and support a network, the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change, or Northeast RISC Network. So in 2018, when we started the RISC network, we named ourselves early. We had about 10 researchers associated with it. These were mostly graduate students and a couple of faculty members. I think no practitioners early on at that stage. And we started meeting for an hour and a half every week, which is a fair bit. And we've continued to work on the projects so basically all of the projects that I've already outlined here have been part of that RISC network process. Since 2018, we've continued to meet almost every week for about an hour and a half. And we've grown the RISC network of practitioners that we're supporting. So we're at nearly 1,100 people on our listserv at this point in the Northeast. And we have between 30 and 35 people who have joined and continue to join our leadership team and keep coming back for an hour and a half of work every week. The mission statement that we developed for the Northeast RISC Network is that our mission is to reduce the compounding effects of invasive species and climate change by synthesizing relevant science, sharing the needs and knowledge of managers, building stronger scientist-manager communities, and conducting priority research. I've already talked about some of the priority research, so I want to give some examples of those other activities that we also do through RISC. One thing that we do a lot of is science synthesis. So if you think back to those questions from managers that we asked way back at the beginning, it turns out that we can answer a lot of those through existing research. We don't need to start new research projects. So we've worked on very broad synthesis topics, like that original topic of how do invasive species interact with climate change in our synthesis document of Double Trouble. And then we've also worked on some very niche topics, like the one on the right there, Out of Control, which was specifically on the effects of climate change on biocontrol agents and their target hosts. Another goal that we have is sharing manager knowledge, and there's a ton of information and knowledge on invasive species management and invasive species management across climate gradients in the Northeast and across climate gradients globally. If only we can find the people who have that information in their head and get them to tell us about it. So a lot of what we've done through RISC is to host webinars that use a format of short presentations followed by longer discussions that give people a chance to meet each other across state and jurisdictional borders and share knowledge. A third goal is to build a strong community around invasive species and climate change. And we do this by continuing to hold events and opportunities for both teaching and learning. These days we do quite a few events each year, and those are capped by an annual virtual symposium, which was held just last month. But usually we're somewhere between 4 to 6 webinars or workshops every year in addition to that symposium. And then finally, we have that goal of conducting original research in support of practitioner needs. And this has also been really successful. So by my count, we've published 25 papers over the last 10 years. Those have stemmed directly from questions posed by managers. And through this time, we've also built and are continuing to build a network of participants that we reach through our website, through presentations, through workshops, and through our listserv. And the number of members on our listserv is shown here. You know, we're closing in on 1,100. Maybe if you guys all sign up, then we'll totally pass 1,100 by the end of this week. In 2023, we did a repeat of that initial survey, the one that we sent out in 2018, that asked research priorities that would help guide us over this next several years. But in that survey, we were also able to get a sense of impacts of RISC participation on our network. This graph shows duration of RISC involvement on the x-axis, so less than 1 year is the one on the left, to more than 3 years is the one on the right. And the red shades are responses to the question, how would you describe your level of knowledge about invasive species and climate change? Darker means higher level of knowledge. So you can see with this graph that people who've participated for longer in the RISC network are significantly more knowledgeable, self-reported about invasive species and climate change. And then similarly, also from that same survey, this graph shows responses to the question of how many ways do you incorporate climate change into your invasive species management. Darker reds indicate more ways, so up to 5 ways that they're incorporating climate change into invasive species management. And again, the bars on the left are recent RISC members, and the bars on the right are longer term RISC members. And the graph is showing that longer term RISC members are incorporating climate change into their invasive species management in more ways. So you can probably tell that I'm really proud of the work that the RISC team has done. This has all happened because the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center created the space for us to focus on long-term iterative process of building translational invasion ecology. I wanted to acknowledge, though, that the framing of academia is typically either or when it comes to actionable science, right? Either you get to be a great researcher or you serve practitioner needs, and not typically both. So I don't want to pretend like everything that we've done, this whole body of work with the RISC network has been easy. A lot of people have put in a lot of time and effort to make this successful, but I don't think that it's an either or. So I just wanted to kind of end here with some of my thoughts on getting the best of both of those worlds, on getting the best out of science and also getting the best of that science into practice. So having our cake and eating it too, here are my thoughts. The first is to use connections to practitioners to generate actionable science ideas. At least for me, coming up with ideas for new science projects is not the easiest thing, right? It's hard. It often leads to a lot of dead ends. Practitioners can really help with this. So important science, important for practice, doesn't necessarily mean that science is boring. Shouldn't even say doesn't necessarily. Why would it mean that science is boring? That science can be cool. Number 2, I would say look for win-wins and pursue those. So just because a practitioner identifies a need doesn't mean that you have to do it. We, in the RISC network, we've in repeated questions, like the top priority for practitioners has been understanding how climate change specifically affects herbicide efficacy, for example, which I have shied away from for years and years, although we're trying to dabble in that a little bit now. So we started with the things that we were most comfortable with, like range shifting, invasive species, synthesizing stuff. Those were all really cool directions. Start with the things that you do well and look fun and interesting to you. Third thing is that science synthesis is still science. So science synthesis is what reviews are. That's often an area of really critical need for practice. And plus, for me, at least, reviewing new literature has always been where I've gotten new ideas to do basic science as well. So don't de-emphasize the importance of doing synthesis. And then last recommendation here is to publish the work that you do to support practice. Case studies are research, ways of connecting science and management is research, surveys are research, data sets are research. If you're in a research focused career, you need to put on your own mask, right, before you can help others. And so focusing on those peer-reviewed publications, but if those publications can align with practice, so much the better, right? And so I'm going to end there and hopefully give us some time for questions. But if you're interested in learning more about either the Climate Adaptation Science Centers or about invasive species and climate change, my email is up here. Please feel free to contact me or check out our website, riscnetwork.org. If you go to riscnetwork.org/northeast, there's a link on our website to sign up for our listserv too. So I'm counting on you guys to get us over that 1100 mark. And I will stop sharing so I can see you all.
Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation, Bethany. It's really awesome to see the progression of identifying, prioritizing, preventing, how that was being co-led with the practitioners that you were working with. You've offered us a lot in this presentation. And for folks who have been posting questions in the chat, I do have a list of them running here. But I do kind of want to offer you a low ball pretty first before we get to some of those others. So you slightly answered this question already in describing what the goals for risk are and its impact. And so my add-on to that is, what's still missing? If you could assign the next decade of range shifting evasion ecology research and engagement with practitioners, what would you prioritize?
Yeah, well, so it's actually not just range shifting. There's other pieces in there too. I guess probably I would prioritize the control and management side of things because that's what the practitioners keep saying is their number one priority. Like how is chemical control being affected by climate change, and how is mechanical control being affected by climate change? So for anybody out there who's working in those areas, those are really important ones for practice. And would yeah, I would love to hear from you because it's definitely not an area of expertise for me.
Thank you. We have another question from Claire, though she did say that we could potentially skip it because you might have already answered it. But just in case you want to add more, what are some of the ways you evaluate success of these research projects? So you did state one of the metrics, right, is the downloads and also the impact. Are there any other metrics that you use or that you've discussed use moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question because that one keeps coming up too when we're talking about like reporting to people. And actually one of the ones that we have kept hearing about ways to report success is actually not in terms of quantitative metrics, but more in terms of stories, that we need to do better at telling our stories in more narrative form of, hey, here's where we started and this is what we learned and here's where we ended. And this is a quote from a, practitioners saying like, this is what we took away from those. So at least from a communication standpoint and trying to convince people that this is useful, those narratives work really well. And we should do more of them. That's like been on the list of one of those things that we hasn't quite made it to the top a lot of times.
Awesome. Thank you. Your next question is from, uh, excuse me if I pronounce this wrong, Diane or Deanne from Oregon. They ask, how can we increase state-to-state communications between land managers for navigating invasive species risk and range change? And they added on, I guess this is a question of how we can make collaborative governmental decisions across state lines and forestry departments.
Um, I think that's part of the gap that the risk networks are trying to fill. And I should have mentioned, but I didn't, that the Northeast Risk Network was the first one. We started officially in 2016, but we really got up and rolling in like the beginning of 2018. But there are risk networks in the Northwest region, the Southeast region, the North Central region, Pacific Islands region. And hopefully one starting in the Southwest and South Central regions of the US. And all of those regions, what I've just said, are related to the Climate Adaptation Science Center regions. So at least the goal within the next year is to have a risk within 7 of the 9 CASC regions, Climate Adaptation Science Center regions. And network building is like the one of the biggest priorities for each of those. So getting help talking across state borders needs some sort of organization that is specifically focused on boundary spanning or crossing those borders like a risk. And I guess that's my hope is that's a gap that the risks can fill. And there's a risk in Canada too, except it's called NISC because it's not regional, it's national.
So your response to that has been actually a little prophetic. We have a question from Deborah from the Great Lakes region is, what about Great Lakes region for risk?
Yeah, Great Lakes region. We're working on that one's still a work in progress. Great Lakes, the Midwest and Alaska are don't yet have a lead for a risk network, but we're still we're still trying and may have more capacity in terms of research support for invasive species over the coming couple of years. So stay tuned. At the moment, we have at least for the Northeast risk. We have a lot of folks from the Midwest states who participate in Northeast risk, given that we have a decent number of species that overlap between those two regions, and a fair bit of shared practice working in eastern temperate forests.
And then I think this might be our last question for time purposes to respect everyone's time. So this is a question directly posted in Q&A. Thanks for a great talk. How have you maintained engagement with managers over the events and changes of the past yearish? You did open up the presentation describing what some of the impact of those changes are, and perhaps this might be another one of those.
Yeah, we were actually just speculating last month because our symposium had lower attendance than we're used to or have for the last several years, and we were wondering how much of that is actually because so many people in federal government, these specific areas that we work in federal government, have either retired or were forced into early retirement or took the deferred resignation plans to leave federal employ early. Uh, Definitely, it's something that we've noticed that we had fewer people than we have for the last several years at that invasive species symposium. State folks, at least in the Northeast, have been less directly affected, but are certainly indirectly affected by changes in federal government and by loss of colleagues that they've worked with for years, decades in federal government. Um, yeah, I really, really hope that in a couple of years we're going to have a huge hiring to make up the all of these losses in federal government because it's definitely from my federal what I've heard from my federal colleagues is a tough time to be in a Fed.
Yeah. Hey, Tony Lynn, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I heard it and felt like I should come on screen. No, but I can, that's okay. I can close this out here. Thank you so much, Bethany. It's like a real pleasure to have you um, headlining our series here. And so thanks for taking your time. You're such a star in this field. And so we talked about what we wanted to do first. And you were just like the first person we wanted to have here opening up this section for a webinar series for us. So thank you. Before everyone leaves, we just want to say that we'll be at ESA this year. We have this wonderful design by Sarah Love, who developed this section design for us, not a logo. So come see us. We'll have water bottles that you can purchase with the design on it. We're going to be tabling. We're going to have a symposium. We're going to have a social probably Tuesday evening of the conference, probably in the conference hotel to make it easy. We're just excited to have some fun together, do this good work. As you heard from Dr. Bradley, it can be super rewarding. This is really just like taking your work to the next level. You can do it as a student. Don't let anyone else tell you different. And we're here to help you develop those skills and be in community together as we learn from each other. So thanks everyone for showing up, almost 100 folks in very busy times. And yeah, join the listserv so you can hear about the next thing. And yeah, we'll all be in touch.